So, to be clear, if we are reviewing poetry on stream, this is for the purpose of education. I want to show people about how to analyze poetry. Please do not try to reproduce. I don't know how you would use this work as a means of piracy. Use this stream as a means. Don't do that. And we're going to be reading very slowly and doing analysis, so I think I'm pretty safe under fair use law. But if not, and the lawyers of Charles Bukowski come after me, please know that I mean no ill intent by reading his poetry on stream. I'm not going to read the introduction here. That doesn't seem very useful. So, Charles Bukowski. It's kind of hard to see. I really wish this thing could zoom, but it can't. Maybe, so I can always take it off of its little stand, which means untaping it from a box set of A Song of Ice and Fire, which would then mean we're like, hold on, scuffed stream as always, then we're here, which might be better. Maybe I should find a way to have a consistent means of adjusting the height of this. So, I do want to check, make sure this is maybe somewhat legible on stream. So, opening my own stream on another device, full screen. So I think it's a little blurry, but maybe that's the focus. Also, the lighting is bad. But if I put it there, I can also increase my bit rate now that I'm not gaming right now. That may help. I really don't know what bitrate means, but I think it helps things look better. In terms of quality, this is 720 source. I mean, that's fairly okay. I could also put it on something to further lift it up, which I might do. So there. We are going to start stream by looking at a poem and just kind of warm up my brain. So this is Friendly Advice to a Lot of Young Men and a Lot of Old Men Too by Charles Bukowski. And I'm going to go through my sort of process that we talked about last stream and mark up this book. And we're only going to do one of his poems. Again, sort of trying to make sure I stay within the realm of fair use, so as to not read the entire book straight through on stream. So, Friendly Advice to a Lot of Young Men and a Lot of Old Men Too. Go to Tibet. Ride a camel. Read the Bible. Paint your shoes blue. Grow a beard. Circle the world in a paper canoe. Subscribe to the Saturday Evening Post. Chew on the left side of your mouth only. Marry a woman with one leg and shave with a straight razor. And carve your name in her anus. Brush your teeth with gasoline. Sleep all day and climb trees at night. Be a monk and drink buckshot and beer. Hold your head underwater and play the violin. Do a belly dance before pink candles. Kill your dog. Run from air. Live in a barrel. Break your head with a hatchet. Plant tulips in the rain. But don't write any more poetry. So, I've read this poem before on my own. I have this book is mine, it's on my shelf. And I read it and I'm like, I don't like this. Partially why I'm trying to read Bukowski on stream is because in general I find his poetry really insufferable because it's so cynical. And so this is a fitting start to a poetry book. I mean, the last line is one of the most striking given the further context. Don't write any more poetry. Right? As to say, you can do anything, good things, peaceful things, evil things, contradictory things, dangerous things. But all of those are better choices than being a poet. Which is interesting. Right. And I really like how the poem really ramps up. Because it starts sort of normal. Especially you would hear people talk about, oh, if you want advice, if you want to find yourself, go on a journey. Right. Go on a journey. Find religion. I don't know what painting shoes blue is a reference to, but again, the things start to get more abstract and impossible. Circle the world in a paper canoe. Right. That is starting to get fairly out there, and then back to normal, but then we get into really bizarre things, marrying a woman with one leg, brushing your teeth with gasoline, all of that, right? I'm also not a huge fan of, just violent imagery, killing your dog. Harper is sitting at my feet, and I had this weird, sort of daydream sort of thing where I was, thinking and lost in thought, and, the idea of, kicking the dog, popped into my head, and I was so revolted by the idea of hurting an animal that, I, started crying. It's the hormones. But again, that's the point of this poem. You can do things that are revolting and evil. You can do things that are practical. You can do things that are dangerous, peaceful, and beautiful. I love this line. Sleep all day and climb trees at night. Right? It's so antithetical to society. And that's the point, I think. You can do things within society, running for mayor. Probably the most societal thing is politics. But sleeping all day, climbing trees all night, going out into nature, again, being a monk, drinking buckshot and beer. It's a really cool line, too. Drinking buckshot. Okay, I think I'm coming around to Bukowski as I sit here and read him. Really cool work. So, it's a fairly simple poem, of course. All it really says is, to me, poetry is worse than. It also says anymore, which is really interesting. And this reminds me of one of my poems, which I can maybe read and talk about. Because I think relating your own work, taking your art, comparing it, contrasting it with other artists is really nice, right? And as a reminder, I'm just going to put down that pen, because that's a line from my poem called, I have a poem called Dolls that is sort of similar to this last line. But poetry is worse than killing. It is worse than suicide. It is worse than politics. You know, running for mayor could actually be seen as like a bad thing. If you are a big anti-government kind of vibe. Poetry is worse than being a hypocrite. Being a monk and drinking buckshot and beer, right? It is worse than hermeticism. Or no, hermit life. Hermeticism and being a hermit are different things, I think. Yeah, hermetic is like alchemy. It is worse than like being a hermit. It is worse than abuse. Worse than probably embarrassment. I mean, doing a belly dance before pink candles is an interesting line, especially as a friendly advice to young men and old men. Now, I don't know Bukowski's thoughts on gender, but for a regular or heteronormative young man or old man, belly dance before pink candles would probably be like a shameful, dysphoric, feminine thing. And yes, heteronormative people or cisgender people can have gender dysphoria. It would just be upon the imposition of like their normal opposite or heteronormative opposite gender being like placed on them. Like a cis man can have gender dysphoria from wearing a dress. And honestly, if people want to know, this is actually like great advice. This is really bad advice, but it's really good advice. If you want to understand the gender dysphoria of a transgender person and you are cisgender, let's say you're a man, put on a dress, go out, walk down the street. See how you feel. Right? And I'm not saying that if you want to, like, I'm not trying to invalidate, right, allyship. If people understand and feel like they can empathize with dysphoria without it, that's fine. But, yeah, if you want to understand, fundamentally, gender dysphoria, be a cis man, wear a dress, go to the store. Be a cis woman, wear something that you consider extremely masculine. Honestly, society is much more accepting of women being masked than men being feminine, so it's not quite the perfect answer, but wear something super masculine, go to the store. That is a good approximation of transgender gender dysphoria. And I don't think anyone would actually do that, probably just to understand. And I don't think you need to be valid, but if you're curious, it's my advice. So, yeah, doing a belly dance before pink candles as a young or old man. I'm just gonna write dysphoria or embarrassment, as I wrote here. Killing your dog, running for mayor, living in a barrel. It's a really funny line, I think. Doing poetry, it is better to do other peaceful and enjoyable things out in nature than doing poetry, according to friendly advice to a lot of young men and a lot of women too. Now, I guess it makes one ask why. Right, this is the start of a book of poetry by a very renowned poet. Charles Bukowski is one of America's best-known contemporary writers in poetry and prose. Right. So why would Bukowski say don't write any more poetry? And if I had to guess, unfortunately, none of this really tells us why. He doesn't give an elaboration. This is don't write poetry. But if I had to guess, I would say poetry is emotionally painful. Writing poetry will, I think, change how you see things. It will impact your life deeply. I think to live a poetic life, to enjoy poetry, or to write poetry, is going to have, for anyone, great impact on the way they live their life. Sort of an addiction in its own sense. Poetic addiction. I'll write that down. And totally messes you up. The more you try to think about expressing emotions, the more you think about that, you're going to end up in this place of self-questioning and questioning about the world. It's a lot of what poetry does. It looks at and describes beauty, but if you're really inquiring into beauty, then what you're going to end up doing is starting to question why certain things are beautiful. I think you see a lot of poetry that's extraordinarily cynical, lamenting at life. I mean, tragic poems, whatever. And I think maybe that's part of what Bukowski is saying. Also, if I had to guess, poetry in some sense, in my case at least, has created a space for the approximation of these feelings. Poetry for me is deeply personal. If I write a poem, right, I'm putting myself into it and trying to deeply, deeply understand it. And in some cases, I've written poems about people doing horrible things. I've written, for example, Miserere, the poem that we spent a lot of time with on stream, which I'm getting more black ink soon, because this one is not completely empty, but not very much ink in here. So, get back to the calligraphy soon. But today's probably just going to be a poetry stream, and then maybe Magic the Gathering at like the 3-4 hour mark if I decide to do that. But poetry approximates evil and allows empathy for all sorts of things that it's really not enjoyable to delve into. My poem Miserere has made me cry because the things I was depicting were so painful and so honest and so real in real life that it hurt, right? The specific line, "Fear not, two placed below, one brought above. you need... No. Yeah, you need only pray for souls already saved. Or no, this service, peacemaker, is in a holy name. You need only pray for souls already saved. Reading and writing that line over and over, like, breaks me a little bit. Because that line is about hurting people and justifying it with religion, which happens in real life every single day. And yet, I was trying to write a poem that understood that person and their struggle in that space. And sometimes it felt like I could understand someone who said those words. So in writing poetry, I think you can understand the person who kills their dog. I think in writing poetry, you can understand the person who breaks their head with a hatchet. Maybe I should try to do that. Write a poem on stream where I try to... It's a really, really excellent exercise in writing perspective, character, and empathy. To take some viewpoint you find abhorrent, or take a person you find abhorrent, or an action, and write a piece of work from the perspective of someone or some people taking that action, and not trying to attack it within that narrative, but saying, I'm going to do my best to understand this perspective. That's a really hard writing exercise to do, and extremely valuable. So, in a sense, this line reminds me of that as well. I'm also going to close my curtains. Look, I put a piano here. I'm back. So why does Charles Bukowski say not to write poetry? Maybe because it's a painful thing that's going to change your life. It's going to addict you. It's going to cause you to think differently about things that you have valued and mess up your life. Maybe because it lets you feel things for those who are evil. So you feel empathy for cruelty. So instead, maybe you should just live any sort of life. Live any sort of life, and it will be happier and more fulfilling completely than writing any more poetry. He might also be saying that poetry is a waste of time. Who knows? He might be saying, writing any more poetry, not in the personal sense, but in the global sense. Saying that the world doesn't need more poetry. Maybe that's what he's saying. I doubt it, since he's a poet. But he's also cynical, right? He's saying that this art, this thing that he does, that he spends his time on, is not going to change. I think probably most people who've spent a decent amount of time doing art have thought deeply about what the purpose of them actually doing the art is, right? Like, is my poetry actually going to help someone? And a lot of people do think their art can change someone's life, and their art can make a difference in the world. Now, I've certainly believed that before. I also don't know if I believe that right now. And if you don't believe that your poetry, your art is going to make a change, should you be doing it? I don't know, actually. And that maybe is what Bukowski was struggling with here. Maybe he was going through that issue. He was saying, I don't see my poetry as valuable. I don't see my poetry as something that impacts anything. So I should tell people, and I should maybe heed his own advice, and just not. Right. Actually seems kind of reasonable. This also describes having an impact. And you might be saying, poetry can't do that. Poetry cannot bring you places. Poetry cannot spiritually fulfill you. Poetry cannot, again, give you these new dangerous experiences. Poetry cannot give you love. Poetry cannot give pain. Poetry cannot give you this sort of primal fulfillment. Poetry can't do any of that. Something I just noticed that I find kind of interesting. Hold your head underwater and play the violin. So, the violin is also art. And he's saying, don't do poetry, but you can play the violin, which is a really fascinating line. Maybe means he sees those two arts differently. The line is also preceded by, hold your head underwater. Right. This line. Ignorance. Head underwater, living under a rock. Maybe he means literally, but in that case, playing the violin is holding your head underwater. He might be saying that that is art, but it does not analyze the world in the same way that poetry does. He might be saying that doing other art other than poetry is essentially ignoring, hiding, holding your head underwater from legitimate expression. I don't know. And poems can mean a lot of things, right? And there are a lot of interpretations here, right? I just said like 5 different interpretations. And maybe they're all connected. I mean, they're all connected through the same poem and the same person looking at them. But, for example, so again, my interpretations. You know, poetry is worse than everything. I mean, that's not interpretation. That's what the poem says. Interpretations could be that you should not do poetry because of the emotional pain, the change to yourself. Could be you should not do poetry because you will begin to understand acts like this. You should not do poetry because it's easier to remain ignorant. You shouldn't do poetry because you don't need more poetry. The world doesn't need poetry. And I don't know what he's saying. If I had to choose an interpretation that I prefer, it's probably the first one that I came to. Don't write any more poetry, because no matter what, Oh, I have another idea. Poetry is never a substitute for experience, which goes along with my earlier interpretation about it being an approximation of experience, where you can start to understand things. But if you say poetry cannot replace living a real life, poetry will not give you experience, poetry will not change your mind, poetry will not do these things, right? You need to go live. You need to suffer and have joy and change and question yourself and your identity and go through the whole breadth of life. Because writing, approximating, trying to create metaphors that tell us something about the world is just taking yourself a step removed. Maybe that's what Bukowski means. Maybe he means don't sit at your desk and write, go do something. Which is also something I've thought before, right? Go do something. And that maybe goes along with the idea that poetry can't make a change, can't have an impact. I don't know. So, that being said, I do like the whole relation to actually experientially living as one interpretation. I do enjoy the idea that poetry is worse and more painful and more tumultuous to your life than all of these things. Of course, I could probably look into Bukowski's past. I could probably look into anything he has said or written as commentary on this piece, of which there might be none, of which there might be some, right? Of which there might be a lot. Poetry, I mean, this is just contradictory, right? And I think it is an excellent way to start a book. I mean, it's a warning, because what follows this is 200 pages of poetry. Unfortunately, this was selected and edited by Abel DeBrito. And it looks like it's a great and deep and full selection of his poetry. However, it means I don't know if this is the kind of thing that Bukowski would actually put at the start of a book, just from this book, right? And maybe the introduction will help. With more than 20 Charles Bukowski poetry books now available in print, it's a big task to put his work together. Big popular poems, poured over everything, included pivotal career poems, and all of that. However, had to be cut down, lots of really good poetry discarded. 95 essential poems barely represent 2% of his output. That's incredible. That's really incredible. So, giving way in the 1970s to his dirty old man macho persona, when he finally achieved success in his 50s, after which he takes in his final years a more philosophical stance on life. So maybe this poem is from the 70s. I don't know. From that dirty old man persona, right? Day-to-day crucial trivialities. Doesn't say much about Bukowski himself, which is sort of unfortunate. It just says these are the poems that are really good and they're essential. Feels sort of self-indulgent as an introduction. So, if I have any criticism so far of the one poem I've read of Bukowski, it's not the poem, it's the person who collected them, if only for not giving me more background in his life. But I suppose that can be found anywhere. But this guy seems like a very, or able, he seems like a very accomplished Bukowski scholar, multiple books, collections, so say for now we trust him, and say maybe this appeared at the start of another Bukowski publication, I'm not sure. But regardless, I think, excellent poem. And on face value, it's a sort of shocking, cynical poem, but the desire to not write poetry is something that I've thought of, and I've liked to think of myself lately, more recently, as an optimist, as someone who has shied away from the cynicality that I particularly had 4 years ago or so, as a moody teenager. And I feel much more optimistic about life, so when I read Bukowski first time last year, I was like, man, this is like antithetical to my way of life. But he asks some of the same questions as me, or raises points that I can relate to with questions that I've asked, things I've thought of, and that is a really notable thing. Is there another Twitch category for writing? No. I think just stay in art. Make sure poetry, calligraphy, writing, history, education. Sure. Poetry analysis. So yeah, that's my thoughts on a singular Charles Bukowski poem. Turn this on. Might help the lighting a little bit. Look out. Not particularly. Maybe if my ring light wasn't purple. That seems to help. And the stream is still very cozy. So, yeah. Bukowski. I think this is an excellent poem. And that's the thing. A lot of poetry doesn't seem enjoyable, or it seems too complex, or it seems to say things you don't like, right? But I don't think you ever really know if you like something until you've dug into it and tried to experience it and looked at it from its perspective. Tried to value it for itself. And that being said, Bukowski maybe has won me over. Or maybe the time I have spent now with the writing of Bukowski has won me over to the writing of Bukowski. This is uncertain. Maybe the next poems are not my style, maybe they're insufferable, but for now, I think I don't really want to just keep going straight through his work, because I'd like to show some variety in poetry, and also fair use law, right? So I'm going to leave this here and maybe find something else to read.